The rain lashed against the tall windows of Ashcombe Manor, a lonely estate crouched beneath the shadows of the Cotswolds. Inside, silence ruled, save for the steady ticking of a grandfather clock. At midnight, a scream pierced the corridors. Servants rushed to Lady Margaret Ashcombe's chamber, only to find her lifeless body sprawled beside a dressing table, a glass of brandy overturned, and a letter clutched in her hand. A final confession, or so it seemed. But when Hercule Poirot arrived the next morning, his little gray cells stirred with suspicion. Suicide, yes, or murder most cunning? He bent low, eyes glinting, whispering, "There is order and method in everything, even death." Chapter 1. The Manor in Mourning. The rain had not ceased for 3 days. It poured in relentless sheets over the rolling hills of the Cotswolds, drumming against the roof of Ashcombe Manor with the monotonous persistence of a funeral dirge. The house itself, a vast brooding structure of darkened stone and ivy, stood hunched upon its foundations like a beast of burden weathering a storm. Its windows were hollow eyes, some shuttered, some faintly lit, all staring into the tempestuous night. At precisely 8:30 in the morning, a motor car splashed its way through the gravel drive, its wheels hissing over puddles, its lamps cutting faint tunnels of gold through the rain. From within emerged a figure unmistakable to those acquainted with the great affairs of crime in Europe. Hercule Poirot. Compact of stature, impeccably dressed in a gray overcoat with a bowler perched neatly atop his head, and his famous mustaches gleaming defiantly against the damp, Poirot presented the curious image of elegance unsullied by weather or circumstance. "Mon Dieu," he murmured, raising his cane to shield his shoes from the worst of the puddles. "To call this an English spring, it is a cruelty, a deception. Always the rain, the mud, eyes following intruders with suspicious intensity. The air smelled faintly of polish, damp wool, and something less definable, something sorrowful." Poirot was led up a wide staircase, the carpet thick yet worn, its once rich crimson dulled by decades. They passed a pair of maids whispering in corners, their eyes red from tears or gossip. Poirot could not yet say. At last they entered Lady Margaret Ashcombe's bedchamber. It was a room of elegance and austerity, heavy curtains of burgundy, a great 4-poster bed, and a dressing table strewn with crystal jars and silver brushes. On the floor, near the foot of the dressing table, the chalk outline of a body was drawn. Lady Margaret had been removed, yet her absence seemed almost more oppressive than her presence might have been. Beside the outline lay a fallen glass, its contents long since dried into a dark stain on the carpet. A letter, carefully preserved within an evidence envelope, rested on the table. Poirot bent low, examining the scene with his customary precision. His eyes darted not only to what was present, but to what was conspicuously absent. "You see, Inspector," he said softly, "the glass, yes, it has spilled. But do you detect, even faintly, the odor of brandy? No. And Lady Ashcombe, she was a woman of habits. If she drinks, it is the liqueur of quality, the finest. Yet this glass is of the common brandy. Already the little discrepancy. It troubles me." Graves frowned. You think she didn't drink it? Poirot's mustaches twitched. I think, mon ami, that the drink was placed to be seen. It is the performance of despair, not despair itself. Poirot gestured toward the envelope. The letter, may I? With a nod, Graves handed it over. Poirot removed the single sheet of notepaper, unfolded it with fastidious care, and read aloud. I cannot bear the loneliness any longer. I have lived a life of privilege, but also of deceit. My husband's fortune was not honestly made, and the weight of guilt marred by restless eyes and fingers that tapped incessantly against his trouser seams. Clara Whitmore, the maid, sat stiffly at the edge of a chair, her pale hands clasped tightly in her lap, as though praying to be invisible. Dr. Lionel Harrington, the family physician, stood by the window, his face solemn, his gaze distant. His reputation was one of discretion, yet his proximity to the household placed him inevitably under Poirot's scrutiny. And lastly, though arriving only minutes later with a flurry of wet coats and disdainful silence, came Beatrice Linton, Lady Margaret's estranged daughter. She was a woman of sharp cheekbones and sharper words, her eyes flashing with an anger that mourning could not conceal. Poirot allowed his gaze to travel from one to the next, weighing them as though they were chess pieces on a board. Messieurs, mesdames, he said softly. I am Hercule Poirot. I have been asked to look into the circumstances of Lady Margaret's death. I must tell you at once, though a letter has been found, and though appearances may suggest suicide, I am not satisfied. There are details, small details, that whisper of another hand at work. Edward gave a short laugh. Surely you don't mean murder. My aunt was, well, she was not without enemies, but suicide seems plain enough. Plain, yes, Poirot agreed. Perhaps too plain. And when a thing is too plain, one must examine what lies beneath. You will each permit me then to ask the questions, petite questions, but important ones. The silence that followed was thick, uneasy. Poirot felt it ripple across the room like the first tremor of an earthquake. Poirot approached Edward first. Monsieur Ashcombe, you were close to your aunt? Edward shifted. As close as one could be to Lady Margaret. She was formidable. She ran this house like a ship. Bien. And you stand to inherit? Edward's eyes flickered. Yes, as her nearest male relative. But don't think for a moment. Poirot raised a hand. I think nothing, n'est-ce pas? Harrington inclined his head. Lady Margaret suffered from a weak heart. I had cautioned her against undue stress. Frankly, I am not surprised by her passing, though the manner of it troubles me. Troubles you? In what way? The doctor hesitated, then murmured. There were whispers of blackmail, of secrets. I urged her to confide in me, but she would not. Still, I cannot fathom her taking her own life. Poirot regarded him keenly. Blackmail, you say? Très intéressant. At last, Poirot turned to Beatrice. Mademoiselle Linton, you returned today, yes? From London? She gave a sharp nod. I came as soon as I heard. Not that my mother would have welcomed me. She cast me out years ago. Poirot inclined his head. And yet here you are. Such is the bond of blood. Her lips curled. Do not mistake it for affection. I came to see what she has left me, or rather, what she has denied me. Poirot's eyes glittered. Ah, you are frank. I admire frankness. And tell me, mademoiselle, Do you write with the right hand or the left? The right, of course. Why? Curiosity only, Poirot murmured. But within his mind, the little gray cells whirred. When the gathering dispersed, Poirot lingered by the fireplace. The rain drummed ever louder against the tall windows. His thoughts arranged themselves with precision, as though upon a chessboard. A glass with no scent of brandy. A letter written in a hand too clumsy for refinement. A maid who speaks of cheerfulness, not despair. A nephew with debts. A daughter with resentment. A physician who hints at blackmail. Poirot stroked his mustaches, smiling faintly. There is order here, he whispered. Order and deception. Already the shape of the truth begins to form. He turned to Inspector Graves. We must see each of them again, and we must be swift. For murder, Inspector, it does not sleep. And with that, the great detective prepared to untangle the first threads of the widow's last confession. Chapter 2. Death. Lady Margaret had maintained her dominion over the estate, but the study had gradually become Edward's retreat, a place of books, brandy, and, some whispered, secrets. Poirot entered with deliberate steps, pausing to observe before seating himself. The study was an austere yet comfortable chamber. Shelves lined with volumes on law, politics, and maritime ventures. A great oak desk piled high with correspondence. A globe standing in one corner, and on the wall above the mantelpiece a portrait of Sir Jonathan himself, stern-eyed, as though scrutinizing the living from beyond the grave. Edward stood by the fireplace, one elbow resting on the mantel, his posture studiedly casual. He was a man of perhaps 35, broad-shouldered, well-dressed in a suit of fine tweed, yet his elegance was marred by the nervous flicker of his fingers against his sleeve. His dark hair was neatly combed, but a lock had fallen out of place, and his eyes betrayed the restless glimmer of a man who concealed more than he revealed. Mr. Poirot, he began, attempting a smile that faltered quickly. I trust you will not detain me long. These are, you understand, difficult hours for us all. Poirot inclined his head with a small bow, settling himself into a leather armchair with the composure of a man entirely at ease. Mais oui, Monsieur Ashcombe. But grief, she does not preclude truth. And it is the truth I must uncover. So, shall we talk, you and I? A conversation, nothing more. Edward lit a cigarette with a silver case, exhaling smoke toward the ceiling. Very well. Ask what you must. Poirot folded his hands. Tell me, monsieur, about your relationship with Lady Margaret. You were close, Inspector Graves informs me. A pause. Edward shrugged. As close as one can be to a woman of her temperament. She was exacting. Proud. My aunt believed in appearances above all things. But she was family, and family binds, does it not? Poirot's eyes twinkled. Family, yes. Horses, cards, perhaps. One must have diversions. Diversions, yes. But diversions can be costly, do you not find? Poirot's voice was mild, but the words landed like stones in a pond. Edward drew sharply on his cigarette, his eyes narrowing. If you mean to suggest I am some desperate gambler, sir, I will thank you to mind your insinuations. Poirot raised a hand. No, I suggest nothing. I merely observe, as is my custom. For example, on your desk there is a ledger. The ink is still wet, though you have just now said these are difficult hours for business. May I? Without waiting, Poirot rose and approached the desk. Edward moved as if to protest, then stilled himself, his jaw tightening. Poirot leaned over the ledger, his neat finger tracing columns of figures, debts, and names scrawled hastily. "Ah," Poirot murmured. "These are not the accounts of prosperity, monsieur. They are the accounts of necessity. You owe money. Much money." Edward snapped the ledger closed. "Private affairs, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot smiled gently. "Private, yes, but in murder, nothing is private." Poirot resumed his seat, his gaze unwavering. "When I saw you earlier, monsieur, your fingers bore traces of ink. You had been writing, n'est-ce pas?" Edward forced a laugh. "I told you. Business correspondence. Nothing sinister." "Perhaps. And yet when I examined the so-called confession letter of Lady Margaret, I saw strokes of ink, fresh, bold, uneven. The same shade as that upon your fingers." Poirot's mustaches bristled. "Curious, is it not?" Edward's composure faltered, his cigarette trembling faintly between his fingers. "Are you accusing me of forging a letter? Of murdering my own aunt?" Poirot lifted his hands, palms outward. "I accuse no one. I merely note what is curious, and what is curious must be explained. Tell me, monsieur, did you write last night?" Edward stared, then turned away, exhaling smoke toward the rain-streaked window. "I wrote," he admitted it. "Understand. Appearances are deceiving. You are a man under pressure, perhaps tempted to hasten the inheritance that would save you. But temptation is not proof. Proof must be sought in the smallest of details, and it is those details which interest Hercule Poirot." Edward's eyes darted, searching for a retort. At last he said, "You think too highly of yourself, sir. You see patterns where there are none." Poirot's smile widened. "Perhaps. And yet." He pointed to the wastepaper basket beside the desk. "In there, Inspector Graves and I will find half-burned fragments of paper. The edges still smolder faintly. What is it, I wonder, that you sought to destroy so hurriedly?" Edward's face blanched. With a swift gesture, Poirot retrieved the basket and drew out a charred scrap. He laid it gently upon the desk, smoothing it with care. The words were incomplete, but legible enough. "Confess at once. Cannot be borne. Margaret." Poirot's eyes glittered. "A draft, perhaps? A practice in forging the hand of your aunt? Or something else, eh?" Edward's mouth worked soundlessly. Then he said, "It was nothing. Scribbles, idle scribbles. I sometimes imitate handwriting for amusement." Poirot raised his brows. "Amusement, monsieur? Forgery as amusement? Très curieux." At that moment a knock sounded at the study door. A maid entered, curtsying nervously. "Beg pardon, sir, but the inspector requests Mr. Poirot in the drawing room. There's news." Poirot rose at once, smoothing his coat. "We shall continue, Monsieur Ashcombe. Oh yes, we shall continue. For the truth, she is like the sun behind the clouds. She cannot be hidden forever." Edward remained by the fire, his expression dark, his cigarette crushed angrily into the grate. As Poirot departed, he whispered to himself, "He trembles, yes. But does he tremble from guilt or from fear? That we must see." In the drawing, the servants. None drew more attention than Clara Whitmore, Lady Margaret's maid of 7 years. It was to her that Poirot now turned his keen attention. She received him in a small withdrawing room near the east wing, a modest chamber where the housemaids mended linens. The light filtered weakly through mullioned windows, and Clara sat perched on a straight-backed chair, her apron folded neatly over her knees. She was young still, perhaps 27, with pale features, wide eyes that seemed always to glisten with unshed tears, and hands that twisted in her lap as though they were not accustomed to stillness. Poirot entered with his characteristic precision, bowing slightly as though she were a lady rather than a servant. It was a gesture that disarmed her at once, for she rose in surprise, curtsying too deeply, almost tripping on the hem of her dress. "Mademoiselle Whitmore," Poirot said gently, "permit me to disturb you a little. It is not the pleasant task to speak of death, but it is the necessary one." Her lips trembled as she answered, "Yes, sir. I will tell you what I can. I loved her, you see, Lady Margaret. She was stern, but she gave me place here when I had none. Without her, I should be nowhere at all." Poirot seated himself across from her, hands folded, eyes attentive. "That is good. The devotion, I see it in your eyes. Now tell me, mademoiselle, of last evening. You were with Lady Margaret?" Clara nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I was with her from 8:30 until she bade me go. She was happy, I think. Happier than I had seen her in many months. She spoke of a journey to London, of seeing the opera, perhaps even buying new gowns. She even asked me to fetch her favorite perfume, the French one she kept locked in her cabinet. That is not the behavior of a woman who—" Her voice faltered and she pressed her handkerchief to her lips. Poirot watched her keenly. "It is not the behavior of a woman who contemplates ending her life, no. That is what you would say?" "Yes, sir." Scene. Late in the night, slipping into Lady Margaret's chamber once more. "Is it true?" Clara went pale, the color draining from her face until she seemed carved of wax. I did go back. Only for a moment. I had left my handkerchief upon her dressing table, and I feared another maid might find it and think me careless. Lady Margaret despised carelessness. So I crept back, but she was already asleep. Or so I thought. I took the handkerchief and left at once. I swear I did not wake her. Poirot's gaze was sharp. "This handkerchief, it is the one embroidered with the initials, not your own?" Her lips parted in confusion, then closed swiftly. Yes, it was a gift. From someone who wished me well." "From whom, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked softly. She hesitated long, her eyes darting as though the truth itself might strike her. At last she murmured, "From Dr. Harrington. He was kind to me when no one else was. But it was nothing improper, I swear it. He is a gentleman." Poirot stroked his mustaches, his eyes narrowing slightly. "A gift from a gentleman to a maid, hidden from the mistress. Mademoiselle, you see how it might look, n'est-ce pas?" Tears welled in her eyes. "It was harmless. He only pitied me, that is all." Poirot allowed the silence to stretch, long enough that her hands ceased twisting, long enough for the sound of the rain dripping from the gutters outside to intrude. Then he asked, very quietly, "Mademoiselle, when you returned for your handkerchief, did you notice anything unusual? Anything at all?" She swallowed hard. Only that the writing desk was open. Lady Margaret never left it so. And there was a sheet of paper upon it. I did not read it, but I saw ink fresh upon the blotter. Ah, Poirot's eyes gleamed. And this paper, it was not the letter of confession, for that we found elsewhere. Something else then. And yet when we examined the desk this morning, there was nothing. Cane tapping rhythmically against the stone floor of the corridor. In the servants' hall below, he paused, speaking softly to Inspector Graves. She is innocent of the act, I think. But she conceals something. Something to do with the doctor. And concealment, mon ami. It is the cousin of guilt. We must tread carefully. Already the threads of deceit begin to knot themselves. As the bells of the manor tolled the hour, Poirot looked back once more toward the east wing, where Clara still wept in her little chair. Yes, he whispered to himself. She holds a secret, that one. And the secret, it may yet unlock the door to murder. Chapter 4. Dr. Harrington's Diagnosis. The manor's silence was deceptive. Beneath it ran currents of tension that no thunderstorm could rival. And Poirot, attuned to such undercurrents, felt them vibrating with every step he took down the corridor that led to the library. It was there that Dr. Lionel Harrington awaited him, summoned at Poirot's request. The library was a cavernous room, its shelves groaning with tomes that spoke of centuries of learning, but also of pride. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light, and the smell of leather and pipe smoke lingered like ghosts of former evenings. Dr. Harrington stood by a table in the center of the room, his tall frame stiff, his medical bag resting beside him. He was a man of middle years with sharp features, a neatly trimmed beard, and the practiced composure of one accustomed to both confidences and scrutiny. Yet even from the doorway, Poirot saw the flicker in his eyes, the small betrayals of nervousness that no degree of medical discipline could disguise. Dr. Harrington, Poirot said with a courteous bow, I intrude upon you, but you understand. It is necessary. When death visits in such strange fashion, one must turn to the physician first, for who knows the body better than he? The doctor inclined his head gravely. Of course, Mr. Poirot. I am at your service. Though I confess this ordeal has shaken me as my clumsy hand. You see my difficulty, yes? Harrington shifted slightly, his long fingers drumming once against the arm of his chair. The official cause of death has not been confirmed. Poison, you say? I had suspected a seizure brought on by her weak condition. Poirot's eyes gleamed. You had suspected, perhaps, but now you know. Inspector Graves has informed you of the traces of digitalis found in the residue of the glass. A medicine you yourself prescribe, is it not so? The doctor's face tightened. Yes, digitalis is common for cardiac treatment, but in careful dosage only. Too much and, well, the result is fatal. I never gave her such a quantity. Poirot leaned forward. Never gave her, no. But might not someone else, someone with access to your supplies, perhaps, have procured it? Impossible, Harrington said quickly. I keep my prescriptions locked. None but I have the key. Poirot tilted his head. And yet, Doctor, a lock is a small thing to one determined. A key may be borrowed, duplicated, misplaced. Do you never allow your bag to leave your sight? Harrington's composure faltered for a second, his eyes darting to the black leather bag on the table. Poirot followed the glance with satisfaction. "You see," Poirot said softly. "Already the bag. She is guilty of her own little betrayal. But let us set that aside. Tell me instead of the woman herself. Was she of the temperament to take her own life?" The doctor hesitated. I would not have thought so. She was proud. Even when ill, she carried herself as though her spirit alone sustained her. But she had enemies. She carried burdens. Burdens, yes, Poirot echoed. And you, doctor, you shared in those burdens? You were her confidant, perhaps? The color rose faintly in Harrington's cheeks. I was her physician, young, impressionable. I pitied her loneliness, that is all. A kindness twisted into something sordid. If you suggest I am entangled with the servants, I will not suffer it. Calm, doctor, calm. Poirot's voice was soothing, though his eyes were sharp as knives. I suggest nothing. I observe everything, that is all. For a moment silence held, broken only by the ticking of the tall clock in the corner. Poirot allowed it to stretch until Harrington shifted again, restless beneath the weight of it. Tell me, doctor, Poirot said at last. Did Lady Margaret confide in you? Of blackmail, perhaps? Harrington stiffened. She hinted at it, yes. She received letters, cruel letters. I urged her to show me, but she refused. She destroyed them as soon as they came. She was terrified, though she tried to conceal it. She said only that someone in her own household threatened her. Ah, Poirot exclaimed softly. In the household. And yet the letters vanish, like the page the maid saw upon the desk, and then saw no more. Always the letters, they appear and disappear. A curious pattern, yes? The doctor nodded reluctantly. Yes, but I do not know who sent them. If she kept a secret, it died with her. Poirot rose, adjusting his coat with meticulous care. No, doctor. Secrets, they do not die. They linger. They whisper. And sooner or later they cry out to be heard. That is what we must wait for. Harrington stood as well, his expression taut, his eyes shadowed. Mr. Poirot, I assure you, I had no part in her death. Whatever you may think of my feelings, I am no murderer. Poirot's mustaches twitched. We shall see, doctor, we shall see. The murderer, he is like the fever in the body, concealed yet betraying himself in small symptoms. And already I observe the symptoms. As he stepped from the library into the dim corridor. Chapter 5. Beatrice Returns. The road to Ashcombe Manor curved like a serpent through the wet countryside, and the motor car that approached sent up plumes of mud as its tires battled the ruts left by last night's storm. The sound of its engine reached the manor before the sight, a low growl of intrusion that set the dogs barking and the servants glancing nervously toward the windows. By the time the vehicle rolled into the graveled sweep before the great entrance, Poirot already stood at the upper landing, gazing down through the tall windows like a general awaiting reinforcements, or perhaps adversaries. The door was thrown open by a footman, and in stepped Beatrice Ashcombe, niece of the late Lady Margaret. She had not been seen within these walls for 5 years, not since a quarrel whispered to be so bitter it had severed the family cord altogether. Yet she entered now with the poise of one to whom the manor had once belonged, shedding her gloves with a flick and surveying the hall with cool disdain. Beatrice was in her early 30s, striking rather than pretty. Her features angular, her dark hair pinned in a severe style that only emphasized the proud line of her jaw. She wore traveling clothes of impeccable cut, though rain-speckled, and a small cloche hat that cast a shadow over eyes both sharp and restless. Her lips, painted a deep crimson, curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile as her gaze swept the hall. "Well," she said, her voice carrying with it the polished accents of London's society, "I see Ashcombe has not changed in the least. Time stands still here, even when the world beyond has learnt to move on." From the stairs, Poirot descended with measured steps, his cane tapping gently on the polished wood. He inclined his head with a courtly air. "Mademoiselle Beatrice, I presume. Permit me to offer my condolences. I am Hercule Poirot, charged with examining the sad circumstances of your aunt's death." She regarded him coolly. "Ah, yes, the famous Belgian detective. I heard whispers even in London that you had come to play nursemaid to family secrets. I wonder, Monsieur Poirot, will you find own making?" Poirot observed her carefully. "And yourself, mademoiselle? Did you count yourself among these enemies?" A flash of color rose in her cheeks, quickly mastered. "We disagreed. That is not the same thing. She disapproved of my marriage, disowned me when I refused to follow her dictates. Yet she was still my blood. Do you think me so heartless as to dance upon her grave?" Poirot steepled his fingers. "No, I do not think you dance. But you are frank, more frank than others here. That interests me. Tell me, mademoiselle, why return now, when for 5 years you have stayed away?" She lifted her chin. "Because her death alters everything. I had to know if her will remained unchanged. Ashcombe is my inheritance by right, though she never acknowledged it. And if she truly has left it to Edward, that poor fool of a cousin, then perhaps my presence here will remind him that the estate is not his to squander." Graves scribbled furiously, but Poirot merely nodded. "And what of these whispers, that Lady Margaret intended to alter her will once more? Did you hear nothing of this?" Beatrice hesitated. "I received a letter from her not 3 weeks ago. Strange after years of silence. She wrote that she was lonely, that she regretted our quarrel, and that she wished to see me. I thought it a trick at first, but now I wonder if she had indeed softened. Perhaps she meant to make amends. I shall never know." Poirot leaned forward, mustaches twitching. "And this letter, mademoiselle, you have it still?" Her eyes narrowed. "No, I destroyed it. I did not wish her words to taunt me when I still doubted her sincerity. I see now that was a mistake." Poirot studied her closely. A destroyed letter, a vanished page from the desk, anonymous notes of blackmail, all vanished correspondence. Always the words concealed, silenced, erased. The pattern gnawed at him like a persistent moth. "Tell me, mademoiselle," Poirot continued softly, "where were you last night?" "Rooms upstairs. Kindly instruct the servants to prepare one. I will not lurk in corners like a criminal when I have done nothing." She swept from the room with all the dignity of royalty, her footsteps ringing sharp upon the floor. Poirot watched her go, then turned to Graves. "You see, mon ami," he murmured. How quickly she seeks to install herself as mistress once more. It is the instinct, the habit of power. And power, it is as dangerous as love when mixed with greed. Graves frowned. Do you believe her story about the letter? Poirot's gaze followed the door through which she had gone. I believe she received a letter, yes. But whether it said what she claims, that is another matter. And if Lady Margaret did indeed soften, did indeed call her back, then it changes much. For reconciliation, it is a threat to some, a promise to others. And in that, one may find motive. As evening drew on, Beatrice's presence cast its shadow across the house. Servants whispered in corners. Edward prowled with the sulk of a dispossessed heir, and Clara Whitmore kept her distance, her eyes darting each time Beatrice passed. It was as though Lady Margaret herself had risen in another form, proud, imperious, and unafraid to wield her tongue like a blade. Poirot stood at the foot of the grand staircase as she ascended, her figure tall against the glow of the sconces. He spoke softly, almost to himself. Yes, Beatrice Ashcombe has returned. But has she come for reconciliation, or for conquest? That we must see. And perhaps, in her arrival, lies the crack that will split this house wide open. And in the hush that followed, the manor seemed to draw in its breath, as though waiting to exhale secrets too long hidden. Chapter 6. Suspicions multiply. The following morning dawned with a sullen sky, heavy with clouds that refused to break, casting Ashcombe Manor in a perpetual twilight. The house seemed no less oppressive for the sun's absence. Its very stones absorbed the weight of suspicion. Within its walls, silence was no longer peace, but that bordered on defiance. Her dark attire only accentuating the pallor of her complexion. She seated herself opposite Edward, and the tension between them was palpable, an unspoken history vibrating across the table like a wire drawn taut. Poirot, from his end of the table, observed all this, with the satisfaction of a gardener watching weeds sprout, unsightly, but revealing. He cleared his throat gently, and the room stilled. Mesdames, Messieurs, he began, his voice soft yet commanding. Permit me to speak openly. We sit here together, but let us not pretend we are united. Each of you carries suspicion in your heart, of the other, perhaps even of yourself. It is natural. But if we are to find truth, we must allow the air to clear, yes? Edward shifted uneasily. Are you suggesting one of us, one of this household, is guilty? Poirot's mustaches twitched. I suggest nothing, monsieur. I merely observe that the murderer is here, among us. Where else would he be? The silence that followed was thick, punctuated only by the ticking of the mantel clock. Clara let out a faint gasp, her fingers tightening on her napkin. Beatrice arched a brow, while Harrington stared into his cup. Poirot allowed the silence to stretch before he leaned forward. Let us consider the facts together. Lady Margaret died of digitalis poisoning. The glass of brandy was tampered with, yet she was said by some not to drink it. The letter of confession found upon her desk was clumsy, uncharacteristic, and I begin to think forged. And then we have the curious matter of letters. Letters of blackmail, destroyed. A letter of reconciliation to her niece, destroyed. A page glimpsed by the maid, vanished. Always the words, they disappear. It is not natural. Beatrice spoke first, her tone sharp. You imply forgery. That someone here sought to disguise murder as suicide. Then we are not speaking of Poirot turned his gaze upon him. Possible, yes, but not probable. You know as well as I, doctor, that digitalis in such a dose does not creep into the body by accident. It was placed there by a deliberate hand. And you, who kept the medicine locked, how do you explain its presence? Harrington stiffened. I cannot. Unless someone rifled through my bag, stole it when I was unaware. Or, Poirot said softly, unless you gave it. The accusation hung in the air like a dagger. Harrington's face reddened, but before he could reply, Clara cried out, her voice breaking. No, he did not do it. Dr. Harrington is not capable of such a thing. He has always been kind. All eyes turned upon her. She faltered, her cheeks burning. I mean, he treated Lady Margaret with devotion. He saved her more than once. To accuse him is unjust. Beatrice's lips curved in a cold smile. How touching, Clara. Such fierce loyalty. And yet, your loyalty to my aunt was not so steadfast, was it? Returning to her chamber in the night, creeping about like a thief. What were you truly after? Clara's hands trembled violently. I told you. I left my handkerchief, nothing more. Poirot raised a hand, halting the mounting quarrel. Enough. To accuse blindly is to throw dust in the air, and the dust, she blinds. Let us proceed with order. Each of you had reason. Each of you had opportunity. But reason and opportunity are not enough. It is the small details that betray. The contradictions. They are what I seek. He turned to Edward. You spoke of debts, monsieur. Tell me, were you aware that Lady Margaret considered altering her will? Edward hesitated, his jaw tightening. I had heard rumors, but she said nothing to me. She never trusted me with such matters. And yet, Poirot said smoothly, you would benefit most if her intentions remained as they were. Beatrice, however, would gain if they changed. That makes you both, in the eyes of logic, equally suspicious. Poirot, secrets, and her loyalty to Harrington. Harrington himself, torn between professional duty and personal sentiment. Each thread wove into a knot. And in the center of the knot lay Lady Margaret, her death the fulcrum on which all their lives now balanced. Poirot paused before the great portrait of the late Sir Reginald Ashcombe, stern in his military garb, gazing down with unyielding eyes. Mon colonel, Poirot said softly to the painted figure, you ruled your house with discipline, yes, but now discipline has gone. The truth lies scattered, and it is to me to gather it. Rest assured, I will. That night, as the manor settled uneasily into sleep, Poirot stood at his window, watching the wind stir the trees into restless shapes. He thought of the poison, of the forged letter, of the vanished pages. Always, always the letters. Words destroyed, silenced. What was it that Lady Margaret had wished to say, that someone so desperately sought to erase? He tapped the glass with his fingertip, his mind already forming the pattern. Yes, he whispered to the storm outside. The suspicions multiply. But the truth, she does not multiply. She is single, precise, inevitable. And when I have her, mes amis, she will strike with the clarity of lightning. Chapter 7. The Confession. Torn. The fire in the drawing room burned low, its embers glowing faintly against the creeping chill of evening. Shadows lengthened across the high walls, turning the carved wainscoting into looming figures. Poirot stood before the hearth, his small form still and contemplative, the light flickering across his polished shoes and the silver arc of his mustaches. He was waiting. He had a way of waiting that unsettled others, for it seemed less patience than inevitability, as though he already knew what would come and was simply allowing the universe to catch up. At last, Inspector Graves entered, his heavy boots thudding across the carpet. In his hand was a sealed evidence envelope, its paper smudged and worn, finger tapping lightly against the scorched paper. And there, it ends. The rest is torn, destroyed. Graves leaned over his shoulder. A confession, then? Genuine? Poirot's eyes narrowed. Perhaps. But observe, the style is awkward, the phrasing uncertain. Lady Margaret, she was not a woman to mince words. If she had confessed, she would have done so with steel in her pen. This is hesitation, clumsiness. It is a forgery, I think. But one made in her hand, oui. Either forced or dictated. He straightened, glancing toward the door. We must show it. Let them see. The guilty one. He will not bear the sight of it. Within the hour, the household was gathered once more in the drawing room. Edward, pale and twitching with nerves, Clara, clutching her handkerchief as though it were a lifeline, Dr. Harrington, stiff and stern though his eyes betrayed unease, and Beatrice, poised, her crimson lips a slash of defiance against her pallor. Poirot stood before them, the fragment in his hand. Mes amis, I have here what remains of a letter, found in the ashes, rescued from destruction. You will listen. He read aloud the few surviving lines. As the words, I am guilty, rang through the chamber, Clara gave a small cry, covering her mouth. Edward muttered something inaudible, while Beatrice's expression sharpened into something between triumph and contempt. Only Harrington remained rigid, his jaw clenched. Poirot laid the letter upon the table for them to see. You observe, it is in Lady Margaret's hand. And yet, there is something wrong. The phrasing, the structure, it is not her. I tell you, this is no confession. It is a forgery. And someone here sought to destroy it when it had served its purpose. Edward sprang forward, his voice cracking. Then it was Beatrice. Who else? She wanted the estate. She wanted to prove Aunt Margaret unstable. This is her doing. Beatrice's lap had even opened. But alas, the forger was clumsy, the paper too durable, the fire too weak. And so here we are. Harrington spoke at last, his tone measured. If you are correct, Poirot, then the killer is clever indeed. He, or she, sought not only to kill but to silence. That suggests someone who feared what Lady Margaret might reveal. Just so, Poirot said softly. And what might she reveal? Letters of blackmail, yes. A change of will, perhaps. An affair. A debt. Always, always, she wrote. And always her words are destroyed. Why? Because they were dangerous. Dangerous to the one who killed her. The room shivered with unease. Edward shifted restlessly, Clara wept silently. Beatrice's eyes burned with cold fire, and Harrington folded his arms across his chest as if to shield himself. Poirot let his gaze travel across them all. I tell you this, the guilty one is here. Already, the lies betray themselves. Soon I shall know which lie is the fatal one. He gathered the letter, slipping it back into its envelope. Until then, mes amis, I urge you, speak the truth now before it condemns you later. But no one spoke. The silence was thick, suffocating. Only the fire crackled, and the storm outside moaned against the shutters. Poirot turned, his steps precise, and left the room without another word. Later, alone in his chamber, he laid the fragment on his desk, examining it under lamplight. He traced the strokes of Lady Margaret's hand, noting where the ink faltered, where the pressure of the pen wavered. To a stranger's eye, it was a confession. To Poirot's, it was a cry for help, or a cry silenced too soon. He closed his eyes, hearing again her words as reported by Clara. She was happy. She was planning. She was looking forward. Such a woman does not write confessions of guilt. No. This was written under duress, or than guilt. It was movement. Someone moved at night when they believed themselves unseen. The house groaned with the wind, the storm outside pressing against the ancient walls. Poirot stepped into the corridor, his slippers making no sound against the Persian runner. The lamps had been dimmed, but faint moonlight slipped through the tall windows, casting pale bars across the carpet. He paused, listening. Somewhere distant, a floorboard creaked. A door closed softly, then a flicker. The briefest ripple of motion along the far end of the passage, too fleeting to be chance. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He moved forward, unhurried but alert, his senses sharpened. The shadow had turned the corner, toward the wing of the house that led to Lady Margaret's study. Poirot followed. The corridor twisted like a maze, its walls lined with portraits of solemn ancestors. Their eyes seemed to follow him as he advanced, mustaches bristling with concentration. He rounded the corner, and there, halfway down the hall, a figure stood frozen in the gloom. It was too dark to distinguish clearly, but the silhouette was unmistakably human. Poirot stopped. Bonsoir, he said softly. You walk late, mon ami. The figure flinched, then darted into the shadows. Poirot gave chase, his small legs surprisingly swift. But the corridor branched, and the figure vanished into the dark like smoke. Poirot halted, catching his breath. He was no young man, and sprinting through manor halls was not his habit. He peered into the darkness, listening. The sound of hurried footsteps faded, then ceased. Whoever it was, they had gone to ground. Poirot straightened his dressing gown, muttering to himself. Ah, but you reveal yourself, mon ombre. You think you are clever, move a sleeve, a cuff, without noticing. Beatrice's gaze sharpened. It is silk. And who among us wears silk at night, monsieur? Certainly not you. Nor I, for my gowns are intact. And Clara wears cotton, plain and modest. I wonder, Edward, have you examined your cravats lately? Edward flushed, fumbling at his collar. I wear wool, not silk. Perhaps it was you, Beatrice, sneaking about in your finery. Beatrice's eyes flashed. If I had been walking, monsieur, I should not have run like a thief when confronted. No. Whoever was seen by Monsieur Poirot is not proud of his errand. Clara's voice broke in, soft but urgent. Please stop. You quarrel and accuse, but none of it proves anything. We are being torn apart. Harrington, who had been silent, finally spoke. His tone was cold. And yet it is proof enough that someone is lying. A man does not prowl corridors at night unless he has business unfit for daylight. I demand to know, Poirot. Did you recognize the figure? Poirot spread his hands. Non, docteur. The moonlight betrayed little. Only the form of a man or woman, swift and determined. But he lifted the silk fragment. It is eloquent. And the truth, she will come soon. He leaned forward, eyes glittering. Consider, mes amis, what lies in Lady Margaret's study that draws footsteps in the night. Already letters have been burned, wills destroyed, pages vanished. Someone fears discovery. Someone searches, desperate to erase the last trace. The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara wept quietly. Edward muttered under his breath. Beatrice stared with icy contempt, and Harrington glowered like a sentinel. Poirot smiled faintly. Yes, the shadow in the corridor. It is the murderer, grown bold in desperation. But boldness she betrays. Soon, mes amis, the truth will walk in daylight. And then, he tapped the silk scrap. This little thread will bind the guilty one beyond escape. That night, the household sat apart, silent, avoiding one another's gaze. It was the silence of conspirators, whether guilty or innocent, they all felt accused. Poirot knew the signs. He had seen the same look among soldiers before a court-martial, in the waiting rooms of magistrates, even in the salons of Paris when scandal threatened to erupt. It was the silence of people waiting to be unmasked. Poirot dabbed his lips with his napkin and stood. Mes amis, he said, his voice gentle yet commanding. The time has come for clarity. We will speak, one by one. No more quarrels, no more shouting. Only the truth, as it presents itself. And he tapped his chest delicately. I shall observe. Edward Whitcomb was summoned first. He followed Poirot into the library, his steps unsteady. He looked younger in the daylight, more vulnerable than the defiant figure of the night before. His hands fidgeted constantly, tugging at his cuffs, smoothing his hair, betraying his nerves. Poirot regarded him calmly. You are troubled, monsieur. It is natural. Tell me, where were you on the night of Lady Margaret's death after she retired? Edward swallowed. In my room. Yes, I drank too much brandy, I admit. I scarcely remember. Convenient, no. Poirot's eyes twinkled. But I do not judge. You are a man of debts, Monsieur Edward. Lady Margaret held your purse strings tightly, did she not? Edward flushed. She She threatened to cut me off, yes. But I would never. Never. His voice faltered. She was my aunt. Poirot leaned forward. You accuse Mademoiselle Beatrice of ambition. But tell me, would not her inheritance benefit you also, if she took pity upon her cousin? Edward blinked, startled. I hadn't thought. Poirot smiled faintly. Mais oui. Perhaps you had not. But think now, monsieur. Think filled the library. Poirot allowed her to weep, then dismissed her gently. He had learned what he needed, not facts, but feelings. Clara was broken, not calculating. Her grief was genuine. Dr. Harrington entered next, stiff as a soldier on parade. His manner was defensive, his chin lifted as though braced for battle. Poirot greeted him courteously. Docteur, you were the guardian of Lady Margaret's health. Her life, it lay in your hands. Harrington's eyes narrowed. And you suggest I failed in my duty? Poirot raised a hand. I suggest nothing. But the digitalis, it came from your bag. Who else could have obtained it? Harrington's jaw tightened. Any servant might have tampered with it. I am not the only one with hands. True, Poirot said mildly. And yet, the dosage was exact. Too exact for chance. You, doctor, know precisely the measure that kills. No servant would. For a moment, Harrington's mask slipped. Then he recovered. And if I wished her dead, why poison? Why not allow her heart to fail naturally? It was inevitable. Poirot smiled thinly. Because inevitability, mon ami, does not come on command. Perhaps you wished certainty. Or perhaps... His eyes glittered. Perhaps someone persuaded you. For affection, for loyalty, who knows? Harrington said nothing, but the flicker in his eyes told Poirot volumes. The doctor carried loyalty, a dangerous one. Finally, Beatrice entered. She moved with poise, every gesture controlled. She sat gracefully, folding her hands in her lap, and met Poirot's gaze without flinching. You have many suspicions, Monsieur Poirot, she said coolly. But suspicion is not proof. Poirot inclined his head. True. But the truth, she gathers herself. Piece by piece she takes form. Tell me, mademoiselle. Grieving, loyal, unlikely to deceive. Harrington, capable, knowledgeable. Bound by professional duty but not immune to passion. Beatrice, ambitious, guarded. Her mask cracked only for a heartbeat. And then, the silk fragment. He recalled its texture, its sheen. He had noticed Beatrice's gown the day before. Silk, black, unblemished. But silk frays. A careful eye might find where a seam had been torn. Poirot rose, his mind sharpening. The web was tightening, each strand drawing closer. The murderer had moved in the night, torn their garment, left their trace. Soon, very soon, the web would close. That evening, as the household sat in uneasy silence, Poirot appeared in the doorway. His eyes gleamed, and his voice carried through the chamber. "Mes amis," he announced, "the truth, she is near. Tomorrow I shall gather you all, and the murderer will be revealed. Until then, sleep well, if you can." He turned, his footsteps precise, leaving behind a silence so heavy it seemed to crush the air. And in the shadows of the corridor beyond, someone trembled. For the web was tight now, and escape was no longer possible. Chapter 10. The Widow's Last Confession. The great hall of Ashcombe Manor was lit with a somber glow. Lamps burned in every corner, their light gleaming off gilt frames and polished wood, but the atmosphere remained heavy, suffused with dread. The storm had passed, yet its shadow lingered, and the household gathered as though to witness a funeral rather than an inquiry. Hercule Poirot stood at the head of the room, his small figure framed by the towering portrait of Sir Reginald Ashcombe. He was immaculate, his dark suit pressed to perfection, his patent leather shoes gleaming, his mustaches curved like twin sabers. His eyes, bright and piercing, traveled from face to face. Edward, pale and jittery. Clara, "So careful a letter. No. You are reckless, impetuous. This crime was not your style." Edward bristled, half rising. "Then who? If not me, then—" Poirot silenced him with a raised finger. "Patience. The truth. She is not hurried. Let us continue." His eyes softened as they moved to Clara. "Mademoiselle Clara, you loved Lady Margaret. You crept into her room that night, it is true, but not to harm, only to retrieve what was yours. She promised you reconciliation in a letter. That letter vanished, destroyed by the murderer. And your grief, your tears, they are genuine. You are no killer." Clara sobbed, burying her face in her hands. Poirot let her weep for a moment before pressing on. "And so we come to Beatrice." Poirot's voice sharpened and all eyes turned. "Mademoiselle, you were cast out once, were you not? Lady Margaret disapproved of your choices, your ambitions. Yet she wrote to you, a letter of reconciliation, as she wrote to Clara. And what became of these letters? Destroyed, burned, torn. Always, always, the words of Lady Margaret are silenced. Why? Because they revealed too much." Beatrice's lips curved into a cold smile. "You have accused me before, Monsieur Poirot. Yet what proof have you? A fragment of silk? A torn page? You call this evidence?" Poirot's mustaches twitched. "Evidence, no. But combined, they tell a story. Consider, mes amis, the forged confession, written in Lady Margaret's hand, but stiff, unnatural. It was dictated, forced. Someone stood over her, made her write words of guilt. And then when she was dead, that letter was torn, burned, hidden. A desperate act. And last night I saw the shadow in the corridor, creeping toward her study. The intruder fled and left behind a fragment of black silk. From a gown, perhaps. Truth. And so you burned them. Yet one fragment survived, enough to betray you. Always, the words, they cling to life. They speak, even from ashes. The room was still. Edward gaped. Clara wept. Harrington looked grim. Beatrice stood trembling, her mask broken. At last she spoke, her voice raw. She would have ruined me. She threatened to tell the world of my liaison, my debts, my shame. She would have left me with nothing, nothing. I could not allow it. I could not. Her confession rang through the hall, stark and terrible. Clara sobbed harder. Edward swore under his breath. Harrington closed his eyes as though in prayer. Poirot bowed his head. There it is. The widow's last confession. Not in her hand, but in yours, mademoiselle. Justice has spoken. Inspector Graves, who had stood silent at the door, stepped forward. His voice was firm. Beatrice Ashcombe, you are under arrest for the murder of Lady Margaret Ashcombe. Beatrice sank into her chair, her defiance gone, her shoulders shaking. She made no protest as Graves took her arm. Poirot watched, his expression grave. The truth had been revealed, yet victory felt hollow. Lady Margaret lay cold in her grave, her household shattered, her kin at war with themselves. Justice was necessary, but it brought no joy. Poirot turned to the others. Mes amis, remember this. Murder, it is never clever. It seeks to silence, but it betrays itself with every detail. Lady Margaret's voice, though smothered, spoke through letters, through fragments, through truth itself. She confessed nothing. It is her murderer who has confessed. He glanced up at the portrait of Sir Reginald, stern and unyielding, and murmured, Rest now, madame. Your last words, though torn, have been restored. The lamps flickered as if in assent, and silence returned to Ashcombe Manor. But this time it was not the silence of secrets. It was the silence of an ending.